The morning her father's farm became hers, Maggie Holloway stood at the kitchen window and watched the sun come up over fields that hadn't grown anything worth selling in 3 years. It wasn't a beautiful sunrise. The sky was the color of old dishwater, and the light that came across the land was thin and flat, the kind that showed everything wrong with a place rather than hiding it. The soil out there had gone pale and cracked, like the skin on the back of an old man's hand. The fence posts leaned. The barn roof had a sag in the middle that her father had been meaning to fix since before Maggie could remember. She was 26 years old, and she was alone. Her mother had gone first. Fever, 2 winters back, quick and merciless. Her father had lasted another year before his heart simply gave out one morning between the barn and the well. He was carrying a bucket. They found him with his hand still wrapped around the handle. The farm was hers now, and so was the debt. She poured herself coffee from the pot on the stove, the last of what she had, and sat down at the table with the papers the banker had brought out 2 weeks prior. Edmund Fitch, his name was. A thin man with the careful, apologetic manner of someone who had delivered bad news so many times, it had become a kind of profession. He'd sat in the very chair she was sitting in now and spread the documents out like he was laying cards for a hand of poker. The figure outstanding against the property, he'd said, without meeting her eyes, is $432. Maggie had not said anything. With the interest accruing monthly and the current state of the land's productivity, he'd cleared his throat. I want to be honest with you, Miss Holloway. The bank has been patient because of your father, because of the relationship. But that patience has a natural endpoint. How long? She'd asked. 6 months. Perhaps 8, if the board is feeling generous. She'd thanked him for coming and shown him to the door, and then stood in the kitchen for a long time without moving. Now she drank her thin coffee and looked at the land and tried to think clearly. The problem was not simply the debt, though the debt was real enough. The problem was the soil. Her father had worked it hard for 20 years and given it very little back. The earth was exhausted. Whatever nutrients it had once held had long since been pulled out by crop after crop of the same things planted in the same places, and what remained was pale and dense and reluctant, the kind of ground that made seeds feel like they'd been dropped into sand. She'd tried last spring. She'd planted what she could afford, tended it as carefully as she knew how, and harvested enough to cover less than a quarter of what she owed. The summer before that had been worse. She needed something different. She just didn't know what. The town of Garner's Crossing was the kind of place where everyone knew your business, and most people had an opinion about it. It sat at the junction of 2 wagon roads out on the eastern flats, a cluster of wood frame buildings with a church at one end and a grain elevator at the other, and everything in between arranged with the practical, unsentimental logic of people who didn't have time for aesthetics. Maggie had grown up there. She knew most people by name, and some of them by the sounds their wagons made when they came down the main road. She was not particularly popular, had never been, but she'd had a place, daughter of Tom Holloway, who was decent and quiet and worked hard and never caused trouble. Now she was something else. She was the Holloway girl, poor thing, trying to hold on to that farm, probably going to lose it by spring. She could hear it in the way people spoke to her at the feed store. That particular softness that wasn't actually kindness, that was just pity with better manners. "You managing all right out there?" Dorothy Crane had asked her last week, touching her arm with that careful touch people used for the recently bereaved and the terminally unlucky. "Fine," Maggie had said. "Getting by." Dorothy had nodded with an expression that made clear she believed neither. The worst of it came from the men who gathered outside Hale's Mercantile in the late afternoons. Victor Hale ran the biggest operation in the county. General store, grain purchasing, a share in the mill. And the men who worked for him or sold to him had a habit of collecting on the porch when the day's work was done. Maggie had walked past them enough times to know the particular quality of their silence when she went by. The way conversations stopped just long enough to be noticed and then resumed just a little louder. "That Holloway place is going to seed. Was going to seed before Tom died, you ask me. What's the girl going to do with it?" Laughter, the kind that wasn't meant to be cruel, but was. Him. Victor Hale himself came to see her on a Thursday, 3 weeks after her father's funeral. She was in the yard pulling weeds from around the base of the water pump when his wagon came up the road. He drove it himself, which was unusual. He had men for that. And he stepped down with the air of someone performing a favor, by visiting. He was not a large man, Victor Hale. Medium height, medium build, with a face that was carefully pleasant and eyes that were always measuring something. He dressed well for the county. Clean collar, good boots, hat that hadn't been sat on or rained through. He was somewhere in his mid-40s and had the particular confidence of a man who had been right about enough things for long enough that he'd stopped seriously considering the possibility of being wrong. Miss Holloway, he took off his hat, wanted to come by and offer my condolences, formal-like. Your father was a good man. Thank you. She straightened up from the weeds, wiping her hands on her apron. That's kind of you. He was. Hale looked out at the fields for a moment, and she watched his face do the calculation she'd seen on Edmund Fitch's face, that same quiet arithmetic of a man assessing what something was actually worth. Hard thing, taking all this on alone. I'm managing. I'm sure you are. He smiled. Thing is, I've been thinking about the land, about what a burden it must be in your situation, and, well, I want to make you a fair offer, Maggie. May I call you Maggie? She didn't say yes or no. What kind of offer? He named a number. She looked at him. He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. I know it's not what the land would have been worth in better years, but the soil's in rough shape, and the market's been— That number, she said slowly, wouldn't cover the debt, Mr. Hale. No, he agreed. It wouldn't cover all of it, but it would give you a fresh start, a clean break. You could go to your aunt in Millhaven, I've heard you mention her, or you've heard me mention her. People talk. He put his hat back on. I'm trying to help you is all. This is a hard situation, and I don't want to see you struggle through it for months and end up with nothing anyway. I appreciate that, she said. Something in her tone made him pause. But I'm not selling. He looked at her for a long moment, not angry, just assessing, the way you'd look at a hand you'd been dealt that wasn't what you expected. You understand what you're taking on. I do. The soil. I know the soil. She met his eyes. I've been walking on it my whole life. He nodded slowly, put his hat back on. Well, offer stands if you change your mind. She watched him drive back down the road and then stood in the yard for a while, her hands still dirty from the weeds, her heart going fast in a way she couldn't entirely account for. She didn't know yet what she was going to do. She only knew she wasn't going to do that. The idea came from an unlikely place. There was an old man named Silas Reed who lived in a small house about 2 miles east of her property, on a parcel of land so modest it barely warranted the word farm. He'd been out there as long as anyone could remember, growing a little of this and a little of that, keeping a few goats, selling eggs at the market on Saturdays. He was past 70, walked with a pronounced lisp to the left side, and had a habit of talking to himself that most people in town interpreted as early senility. Maggie had known him her whole life without knowing him particularly well. He'd been a friend of her father's in some loose, occasional way. They'd share a word at the market, help each other out sometimes with a spare tool or a strong back when one was needed. He had come to her father's funeral and stood in the back and left without speaking to anyone. She went to see him because she had run out of other ideas. It was a Tuesday in early May, warm and bright, and she found him in the back of his property doing something complicated with a series of wooden frames and a small flock of chickens. He was moving the frames around with a focused, deliberate energy that didn't look like a man who was losing his mind. Miss Holloway. He didn't look up. Figured you'd come around eventually. You figured? Your father talked about you some. He finally looked at her and his eyes were sharp and present. Said you had good sense when you weren't letting pride get in the way of it. She almost smiled. He would say that. What do you need? She told him. All of it. The debt, the soil, the offer from Hale, the months she had left. She told him she'd been reading everything she could find about soil restoration and that most of it required either money she didn't have or time she didn't have, and she was running out of both. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, watching his chickens scratch at the ground inside the wooden frame. You know what they're doing? He asked. She looked at the chickens, scratching, more than scratching. See how they work the top layer? Loosen it up, turn it over. And the manure goes right into the soil, natural as anything. He tapped the wooden frame with one finger. I've been moving these around my property for 15 years. Every patch of ground they work through comes out different on the other side. Dark, loose, full of life. He looked at her. You've got how many acres? 62 workable. He sucked air through his teeth. You'd need a lot of birds. How many? He thought about it. 200, give or take, to make real progress in the time you've got. He paused. You know what chickens cost. I know what they cost new, she said. What about ones nobody wants? He looked at her for a moment, and something shifted in his expression, a kind of reassessment, like a man who'd expected a conversation to go one way and found it going another. Now, that's a different question. She spent 4 days tracking down every unwanted bird in a 30-mile radius. The feed store had a batch of 60 pullets that had arrived damaged in transit, not injured exactly, but weak, undersized, the kind of stock that experienced farmers bypassed in favor of stronger birds. The man at the store had been about to send them back when Maggie arrived. How much? She asked. He named a price per bird that was less than half the going rate. I'll take all 60, she said. Miss Holloway, those birds aren't... I know what they are. She counted out the money. I'll take them. She found more at a farm 20 miles north where a man named Garrett was liquidating his flock after deciding to go into cattle. His chickens were older, past peak laying, and he'd been having trouble selling them because nobody wanted to invest in birds that wouldn't give them eggs. He had 112. She bargained him down to a number that made her stomach clench when she handed it over, because it was nearly the last of what she had. With the pullets from the feed store and the older birds from Garrett and a handful she negotiated from 2 other sources, she ended up with 183 chickens. She drove them home in crates stacked in the back of her wagon, listening to the noise they made, and she thought, this is either the smartest thing I've ever done or the end of everything. But Silas came the next morning. She hadn't asked him to. He just appeared at the edge of her property at first light, with his list to the left and a set of rough-cut lumber in the back of his mule cart, and no explanation beyond a slight nod in her direction, as if they had agreed to something without speaking. They spent 3 days building the mobile coops. Silas called them tractors, though they had no wheels, just wooden frames with mesh bottoms that could be dragged by a rope to a new position. She'd never built anything like them before. She'd never built much of anything, truth be told. Her hands were used to kitchen work and garden work, not carpentry. She hit her thumb twice with the hammer on the first day and said words she would not have said in front of her mother, and Silas, to his credit, didn't laugh. Again, he'd say, when she drove a nail crooked. I see it, she'd say, so fix it. By the 3rd day she was driving nails straighter and he'd stopped commenting, which she took as approval. They started the birds in the south field, the worst section of her land, where the soil had gone the most completely to dust. She watched the first morning with a kind of anxious focus that felt close to prayer without being prayer. The chickens moved through the frames with their particular mechanical intensity, heads bobbing, feet working at the pale ground, and within an hour the surface of the soil looked different, disturbed, opened up, like skin after a good scrubbing. It'll take weeks before you see real change, Silas said, standing beside her. I know. And you've got to move them regular. Every 2 days, 3 at most. I know. He looked at her sideways. You're not patient. I'm learning, she said. The talk started almost immediately. She didn't hear most of it directly. People in Garner's Crossing were too well-mannered for that, mostly. But it reached her through the particular channels that small-town information traveled. A word from Dorothy Crane, an overheard sentence at the feed store. The careful look on Edmund Fitch's face when he came to check in at the end of the month. The Holloway girl had bought a bunch of sick chickens and was dragging them around her dead field. That was the most charitable version. The others were unkind in the specific way that mixed genuine curiosity with the satisfaction of watching someone fail in an interesting way. 200 birds, she heard someone say outside the mercantile when she was coming around the corner. What's she going to do with 200 birds? Can't eat them all herself. Not the plan, from what I hear. She's got some notion about them fixing the soil. The soil. A pause. A sound that wasn't quite laughter. Lord help her. She rounded the corner and the 2 men, Cal Drucker and his brother, both of them farmers, both of them sold regularly to Hale's grain operation, stopped talking and nodded at her with those careful, neutral expressions people put on when they've been caught. Morning, she said, and kept walking. She moved the chicken frames that afternoon with more force than was strictly necessary, dragging them across the newly disturbed soil, and she told herself it didn't matter what Cal Drucker thought. It didn't matter what any of them thought, but her hands were shaking a little, and she stayed out in the fields until dark so she wouldn't have to sit alone in the kitchen and hear the silence where her parents used to be. 3 weeks in, something happened. She was moving the frames through the middle field when she noticed the soil beneath where the first birds had started. She stopped walking and knelt down and pressed her hand flat against it. It was darker. Not dramatically, not transformed, but darker, noticeably, than the pale, exhausted earth she'd started with. She scratched at it with her fingers, and it gave way more easily, came up in clumps rather than clouds of dust. She could feel, even through her fingertips, that something had changed about its texture. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. She had read about this in the agricultural pamphlets she'd been collecting for months, had understood it intellectually, had been counting on it as a possibility. But knowing something in your head and seeing it happen in front of you were different things. She felt something move through her chest that she couldn't name precisely. Not joy, not yet, too fragile for that. Something more like the first cautious breath after a long time underwater. She went to find Silas. He was at his own place, mending a section of fence with the calm efficiency of a man who had mended many fences. She showed him the soil on her hands, the dark clumps still caught under her fingernails. "Hmm?" he said. "Is that good?" she asked. "Is that what you expected?" "Expected, yes." He kept working. "What did you expect?" She thought about it. "Hope, I guess," she said finally. "I expected to hope." He looked at her over his shoulder. "There you go, then." Okay. She planted the first section 6 weeks in, when the soil the chickens had worked through had rested and absorbed enough to be ready. She put in beans, following a method Silas described to her from memory. His father's method, he said, from a place with soil not unlike this. She worked the seeds in by hand, on her knees, row by row, moving slowly because she wanted to do it right. When she stood up at the end of the day, her knees were caked, and her back ached in the particular low way that meant she'd been bent wrong and would feel it for days. She looked at the freshly planted rows in the failing light. This was it. This was the bet she'd placed with everything she had. Either these seeds would take in this soil and grow into something that could answer the question of the debt and the months remaining, or they wouldn't. She walked back to the house, washed the soil off her hands at the pump, and made herself supper from what was in the pantry. There wasn't much. She'd need to be careful. She sat at the table. Her father's table, her mother's table, her table now. And she ate and tried not to think about Victor Hale's careful, pleasant face, about Edmund Fitch's apologetic spread of papers, about Cal Drucker and his brother and their almost laughter outside the mercantile. She tried not to think about how many things could still go wrong. She looked out the window at the dark fields, and she thought, come on, come on. The first real sign came in the 3rd week after planting. She was out before dawn. She was always out before dawn now, the habit of long farm days finally catching up with her, walking the rows with a lantern because she couldn't wait for proper light. And there, in the earliest section, she saw it. The seedlings had come up. Not all of them, not yet, but enough. Dozens of small pale shoots breaking the surface of the dark soil, reaching up through the ground with the particular blind confidence of growing things that don't know yet what they're up against. She stood there in the dark with the lantern and looked at them. She had been holding herself together, she realized, with a kind of determined compression, keeping everything small and internal and managed for months now. Since her mother, since her father, since the papers and the debt, and Victor Hale's wagon coming up the road. She had kept herself compressed because if she let anything out, there was too much of it and no bottom to it, and she was alone and couldn't afford the time it would take to find the bottom. But she stood there in the dark and looked at those seedlings, pale and thin and stubborn as anything, pushing up through soil that 6 weeks ago had been dust, and something in her chest unlocked in a way she hadn't planned for. She didn't cry. She wasn't the crying kind, or at least she'd decided not to be. But she made a sound, one sound, in the dark, with nobody to hear it, that was something between a breath and a word and a decision. Then she picked up the lantern and went to check the next row. She was still checking rows when the sun came up and turned the field gold and pale pink, and she could see, properly, in real light, what the soil looked like, and what the seedlings looked like, and what 62 acres of land that people had been calling worthless for 3 years was beginning, slowly, against all reasonable expectation, to look like. She was filthy and tired, and her back hurt, and she had not eaten breakfast. She stood at the edge of the field and she let herself feel, for exactly 1 minute, the particular private satisfaction of a person who has been told they would fail and has not yet failed. Then she went inside to eat something and get back to work. The beans came up crooked. That was the first thing, not the triumphant row of green that Maggie had been picturing in the back of her mind, but a jagged, uneven line of seedlings that leaned in different directions and came up in clusters where she'd planted them too close and left gaps where she hadn't planted them close enough. She stood over the first row on a Thursday morning in early June, with her hands on her hips and her jaw set, and told herself this was fine. This was normal. Plants didn't come up perfect. She went to find Silas. He was already in her south field when she got there, walking the rows she hadn't reached yet, bending down occasionally to press his thumb into the soil. He had started coming by most mornings without being asked and without explaining himself, and she had stopped questioning it. She needed the help, and he seemed to need something to do with his time, and neither of them felt the necessity of making that arrangement into a conversation. "The beans are crooked," she said. "I know." He didn't look up. "I saw. Is that a problem?" "Depends." He straightened up with some effort, his left side hitching up slower than the right. "Crooked means they're working, means they're looking for light. What you've got to worry about is the ones that don't come up at all." She looked at the gaps in the rows. "There are some of those. There are always some of those." He moved to the next section, bent down again. "The soil here is good. Better than I expected, honestly. 3 more weeks and you can start the second planting." "Can we afford to wait 3 weeks?" He looked at her over his shoulder with an expression that said the question was not a useful one. "Can't plant in soil that's not ready. Waiting's not optional. It's arithmetic." She walked the rows beside him for a while, not talking. The morning was warm and clear, the kind of day that felt like a promise, if you were in the right frame of mind, and a taunt if you weren't. She was somewhere in between. "People are talking," she said finally. "People always talk. They're saying the chickens aren't working, that I'll be out by harvest." She paused. "Cal Drucker told someone at the feed store that I'd be better off eating the birds now, while I still had the option." Silas made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Cal Drucker's been farming the same 20 acres the same wrong way for 30 years and wonders why his yields keep dropping." He stopped walking. "You know what's interesting? He's not wrong that chickens can be eaten. He's just wrong about the order of operations." Despite herself, she almost smiled. "The talk doesn't matter," he said, more directly now. "What matters is what's happening in the ground. And what's happening in the ground is working, slower than you want, but working." She nodded. She knew he was right. Knowing he was right didn't make the talk easier to carry, but that was her problem, not his, and she'd learned early that there were categories of difficulty you just absorbed on your own. They moved the chicken frames that afternoon, she and Silas together, him directing and her pulling most of the rope because his back couldn't take it, to the next section of the center field. The birds transferred without much drama, settling into the new patch of ground with their characteristic purposeful scratching, and Maggie stood and watched them for a minute longer than was strictly necessary. 183 chickens. She'd lost 4 since the start, 2 to what looked like a respiratory issue, 1 to a fox she'd dealt with firmly, 1 that had simply stopped eating and couldn't be convinced otherwise. 179 left. Still enough. She counted them sometimes at night, not because she needed to, but because it helped her sleep. The weeks moved the way the early weeks of a thing always move, with a slowness that felt like punishment while you were in them, and would probably feel like nothing at all in retrospect. Maggie was up before the sun, and in the fields until dark, and the hours between were filled with the particular rhythm of physical work that leaves no room for overthinking. Move the frames, check the seedlings, water where the soil had dried, walk the fence, fix the thing that had broken since yesterday. There was always something that had broken since yesterday. The south fence needed 3 new posts after a section collapsed in a storm in the second week of June. The pump handle cracked, and she spent 2 days drawing water with a bucket until she could afford the part to fix it. One of the chicken frames warped in the rain, and she and Silas spent a morning reconstructing it with wood that wasn't quite the right size, working in silence broken only by the sound of hammering, and Silas occasionally saying no, like this, and repositioning her hands. "You're better at this than you were," he said one morning, watching her drive a nail. "That's not a high bar. It's still progress." She didn't respond, but she registered it. Silas didn't give compliments with any frequency. When he said something positive, it meant something. She was alone a lot, more than she'd been even in the worst months after her parents died, because those months had at least involved the traffic of grief, neighbors coming by, the banker, the pastor, people who wanted to help or feel like they were helping. Now she was just a woman working land that might or might not come back, and the people who might have supported her were largely convinced she'd fail, which made their company a complicated gift she could mostly do without. She ate simple things and ate them alone. She read in the evenings when she had the energy, the agricultural pamphlets, and a few books she'd borrowed from the small lending library at the church. And sometimes the reading helped, and sometimes it just made her aware of how much she didn't know, and how little time she had to learn it. She missed her mother on Thursday evenings for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. Thursday had been baking day. The house had always smelled a particular way on Thursdays. She missed her father when she found something she'd done wrong and didn't have anyone to ask. She kept moving. That was the only option that made any sense. In the 4th week of June, she sold 20 eggs at the Saturday market. The older hens from Garrett's flock had started laying again, better than expected, and used the money to buy seed for the second planting. Dorothy Crane stopped at her table and looked at the eggs with a careful expression and said, "These are yours? From the farm?" "That's right." "How are things going out there?" "Really?" Maggie met her eyes. Dorothy was not a cruel woman. She was the kind of woman who meant well in ways that didn't always land, and she'd been a presence in Maggie's life since childhood. Not always welcome, but always consistent. "Really?" Maggie said. "They're going. I heard Victor Hale is still interested in purchasing." "He can stay interested." Dorothy blinked, then nodded slowly. "You sound like your father." "I'll take that." She sold all 20 eggs and bought the seed and walked back to her wagon feeling, for the first time in a while, something close to solid. The second planting went in the last week of June. This time she planted squash and potatoes, root vegetables, Silas's suggestion, because the soil work the chickens had done went deepest, and the roots needed that depth to do what they could do. She put in more than she had the first time, working across 3 sections of the now rested south field, where the birds had finished their first full pass. Silas watched her from the edge of the field on the first morning. "You're planting too shallow on that row," he said. "I know." She didn't stop. "I'm correcting it as I go." He watched for another moment. "You get faster every time. Does that mean you'll stop watching me like I'm about to do something wrong?" "No," he said, "but I'm watching differently." She planted for 2 full days, on her knees in the soil, and when she was done, she stood at the edge of the field in the late afternoon light and looked at what she'd done. The south field, which in April had been pale and cracked and useless, was now dark and planted and alive in the particular waiting way that planted fields are alive. The beans from the first planting were up and going, crooked and committed, and the squash and potatoes were in the ground, and doing whatever seeds do in the dark before they decide to grow. She had 3 months until harvest. Maybe less. She had enough food for 6 weeks if she was careful. The egg money helped. Not enough, but it helped. She did the math at the kitchen table at night, the same math she'd been doing for months, moving numbers around on paper to see if there was some arrangement of them that worked. There wasn't quite, not yet, but the gap had gotten smaller. Smaller was something. Smaller was not nothing. One evening in early July, Silas stayed for supper for the first time. She hadn't planned it. She'd just looked up from what she was doing and noticed it was later than she'd thought, and that he was still there, sitting on the fence post at the edge of the yard and looking at the fields with the considering expression he usually reserved for soil samples and warped wood. "You might as well eat," she said. "There's enough." He looked at her for a moment, then got up from the fence post with that listing motion. "What is it?" "Beans from the south field, first harvest." He stopped walking. "Already?" Already? She couldn't keep something out of her voice when she said it. He came inside and sat at the kitchen table, her father's chair, without knowing it was her father's chair, and she let it be. And she put food in front of him, and they ate in the comfortable silence of people who have spent enough days working together to not need to fill the space. "They're good," he said, "about the beans." "They are." She ate one. It was good. It was in fact better than she'd expected from a first-season planting and recovering soil, firm and green and tasting like something that had come from the ground at the right moment. "The soil is better than it looks." "The soil is better than it was," he corrected. "It's going to be better still." She looked at the bowl in front of her. "Silas, why are you doing this, helping me? You don't owe me anything." He didn't answer immediately. He ate 2 more bites, and she thought he might not answer at all, which was his right. "My wife and I had a farm," he said finally. "North of here, bigger than yours. Good land." He looked at his hands. "When she died, I couldn't make myself care about it anymore. I sold it to a man who didn't deserve it and moved out here to this little place and decided I was done with serious farming." A pause. "But I still know things. Seems like a waste, knowing things and not using them." Maggie was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry about your wife. It was a long time ago. That doesn't always make it shorter." He looked up at her then, and something in his expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but opened up for just a second before closing again. "No," he said, "it doesn't." They finished eating. She washed the bowls. He thanked her and left, walking the 2 miles home in the dark, as he apparently did without any trouble. She stood at the window and watched him go and thought about how people carried their losses, the different shapes that carrying took. The first week of July brought heat that settled over the county like something physical, pressing down on the fields and the town and everyone in them with a flat, relentless weight. Maggie worked in it the way you work in bad weather. You can't change, by stopping thinking about it and just moving. She soaked rags in water from the pump and wrapped one around her neck and moved the chicken frames in the early morning before the worst of the heat, then worked the soil and checked the seedlings and did what needed doing in the hours that were slightly less brutal. She was in the north field on a Wednesday when she heard the wagon. She looked up from where she'd been checking a section of fence and saw Victor Hale's rig coming up the road. Not his personal wagon this time, but the larger one, with 2 men she didn't know sitting up on the bench. Hale himself was in back, which was an unusual arrangement that told her something about the nature of the visit. He climbed down when the wagon stopped at her gate. "Miss Holloway," the pleasant face, the careful eyes. "Thought I'd stop in and see how things are progressing." She put down the fence pliers and walked toward him. "Mr. Hale." He looked past her at the fields. She watched him look, watched the thing that happened in his expression when he saw that the south field was green, but actually green, the beans standing in their crooked, committed rows, the squash starting to sprawl, when he had clearly been expecting pale dirt and failure. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "You've been busy. That's one word for it." She stopped at the fence line between them. She didn't open the gate. "What can I do for you?" "Just checking in." He pulled his attention back from the fields to her face. "My offer stands, as I said. In fact, given the work you've put in," he paused, recalibrating something, "I'd be willing to adjust the number, somewhat." She looked at him. "How much is somewhat?" He named a figure. It was higher than the first one. It was still not enough to cover the debt and start over anywhere that wasn't a significant step down from what she had. "That's generous," she said. "No." Something moved across his face, very briefly. Not anger, something more controlled than anger. "You're doing well so far," he said, in a tone that made "so far" do a lot of work. "But harvest is a long way off. A lot can happen." "It can," she agreed. "Soil that looks good in July can disappoint you in September." "That's true of a lot of things." He held her gaze for a moment. His 2 men were watching from the wagon seat with expressions she didn't like, that particular masculine stillness that was either boredom or the quiet before something. "I'm trying to help you," Hale said. Same words as the first time. "I know you are," she said. Same tone as the first time. He held for another beat, then nodded and put his hat back on.
climbed into the back of the wagon with the dignity of a man who had decided to treat this as a minor detour rather than a rebuff. She watched the wagon go and then went back to the fence and picked up the pliers and finished what she'd been doing, but her hands were tight on the handles and she drove the staples with more force than the fence required. She told Silas about it the next morning. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the south field, which was green enough now to be visible from where they were standing. "He's not going to stop," Silas said. "No. He doesn't like losing. Does anyone?" "Most people," Silas said carefully, "lose things and move on. Victor Hale has spent 30 years arranging things so that he doesn't have to." He looked at her. "You're interrupting an arrangement." She thought about that. "Because of the land?" "Because of what the land means. If you succeed out here," he gestured at the field, "it means something failed. Something he said was worthless turned out to be worth something. He doesn't like the arithmetic of that." "He cannot like it," she said. "He can," Silas agreed. "Just be careful." She wasn't sure exactly what he meant by careful, and when she asked, he didn't elaborate, just shook his head with the expression of someone who knows a thing without being able to explain it in a way that's useful. She let it go. She had too much to do. The beans came in the second week of July. Not all of them, but the first section, enough to fill 8 crates with the kind of dark, firm, even produce that she had not honestly expected from a first-season recovery planting. She and Silas harvested them on a Saturday, working from the east end of the row, and the work had the particular quality of work that has been a long time coming. Slower than it needed to be because she kept stopping to look at what she was picking. "Keep moving," Silas said. "We've got ground to cover." "I know." She kept picking. "They're good, though." "They're good," he agreed, and she could hear that he meant it without ceremony. She brought 6 crates to the Saturday market and sold 4 of them inside the first hour. Dorothy Crane bought a bag and looked at the beans with an expression Maggie couldn't quite read. Something between surprise and the particular discomfort of having expected a person to fail and finding out they hadn't. "These are beautiful," Dorothy said. "Thank you." "From your farm? The South Field?" "That's right." Dorothy turned a bean over in her hands. She was quiet for a moment, and then she looked up. "I owe you an apology," she said, unexpectedly. Maggie looked at her. "For what?" "For what I said to Ruth Fitch in March, about the chickens." She set the bean down on the table. "I didn't say it to be cruel, but I didn't say anything kind either, and I should have." She paused. "Your father would have been—" She stopped herself. "You're doing something real here." Maggie held the woman's eyes for a moment. It wasn't a comfortable moment for either of them. "Thank you," she said, "for the apology." Dorothy nodded, paid for her beans, and moved on. Maggie sold the remaining 2 crates to a restaurant man from the next town who had stopped at the market by chance and was looking for suppliers. She gave him a number for the squash, which would be ready in 3 weeks, and he wrote it down and said he'd come back. She drove home with an empty wagon and enough money to buy supplies for the next month and a number in her head that she turned over carefully. The gap between what she had coming in and what she owed had gotten smaller again. The squash, when it came in, was enormous. Not monstrous, not the way a drought-stressed plant will sometimes put all of its energy into one desperate, oversized fruit, but uniformly, solidly large, the kind of produce that comes from soil that has been properly prepared and given the right conditions to do what it does. She and Silas harvested it on a hot Tuesday, and both of them were quiet for longer than usual, because the evidence was hard to argue with. "The potatoes are going to be the same," Silas said, pushing a squash over to check the underside. "How do you know?" "I put my hand in the ground last week. You can feel when it's right." He straightened up. "The soil in that section is better than good. It's as good as anything I've worked in 40 years. She looked at the squash piled around them. She had not let herself fully believe it would work, not even through the months of getting up before dark and driving the fence staples and eating careful small meals and counting chickens. Some part of her had held back from the full belief as a hedge against the possibility of loss. But looking at this, the squash and the memory of the beans and the potato plants pushing up their dark, healthy leaves over in the east section, she let herself deliberately and carefully believe it. The fair was 6 weeks out. The county fair, held every September in the town of Kellner, 15 miles east,
where farmers brought their best and the judges made their decisions, and people came from 3 counties around to see what this part of the world could grow. She'd been thinking about it since spring. Hadn't said anything to Silas, hadn't let herself think too directly about it, because the fair felt like tempting something. Like if she thought about it too hard, it would find a way to be taken from her. But she thought about it now, standing in the squash field with the afternoon light going long and golden across the plants. She had produce that could win. She knew it the way you know something you've been trying not to know. She had produce that was better than anything she'd seen at the fair in years. She had a story that the fair would be interested in, not because she wanted attention, but because that was how fairs worked, because people talked, because when you showed up with squash that size from land everyone knew had been dead last year, that was a story that told itself. She said none of this to Silas, but when they were loading the last of the squash into the barn, and he said, 6 weeks, with a particular inflection, she understood he was thinking about the same thing. 6 weeks, she agreed. He looked at her for a moment. I'll help you pick the best ones. She nodded. They went inside to wash up. The farm was not fixed. She was still in debt and still behind, and there were still 100 things that could go wrong between now and September. The potatoes hadn't been harvested yet, and the south field still had sections that needed 2 more rounds of the chickens, and the pump had been making a new sound since last week that probably meant something. But the squash was in the barn, and the beans had sold, and the soil that Victor Hale had looked at in April with the expression of a man being generous about something worthless was dark and deep and working. She sat on the porch after supper as the evening came in and listened to the quiet sounds of the farm settling, the chickens in their coop, the wind moving through the fields, the distant ordinary sounds of a county going to sleep. And she didn't feel triumphant or transformed or any of the things she'd imagined she might feel. She felt tired and stubborn and more certain than she'd been in a long time about the ground beneath her feet. That was enough. For now, that was enough. The potatoes came out of the ground like something from a different world. Maggie had been braced for good. She had not been braced for this. She pushed the fork into the earth on the first morning of harvest, a cool Tuesday in mid-August, the sky white with high clouds, and turned up a cluster of potatoes that made her stop and just look at them for a moment. Big, dark-skinned, firm, the kind of potato that had no business coming out of ground that 3 months ago had been packed clay and dust. Silas was working the next row over. He didn't say anything when she held one up, just looked at it with the particular expression of a man who had known something was possible and was still surprised by it actually happening. "How many rows you think like this?" she asked. "Most of them." He went back to his fork. "Maybe all of them." They harvested for 3 days. By the end, she had more produce than her barn could comfortably hold, and she had to stack crates in the breezeway and cover them with burlap against the night chill. The restaurant man from the next town came back, as he'd said he would, and bought squash and beans and stood in her barn looking at the potatoes with an expression that was frankly commercial. "I want a standing arrangement," he said, "for next season." She kept her face neutral. "We can talk about that after the fair." "You're entering the fair." He said it like he was confirming something he'd heard rather than asking. "I am." He nodded slowly. "Well?" He looked at the crates again. "After the fair, then." She watched him drive away and then went and sat on the porch steps for 10 minutes doing nothing, which was the closest she ever got to celebration. She had made a decision about the fair that she hadn't told Silas about yet, or anyone. She wasn't going to enter just the standard categories, best squash, best potato, that kind of thing, the usual farmers' entries that people brought in by the wagon load. She was going to request the soil restoration demonstration category, which was a newer addition to the fair, added 3 years ago to encourage modern farming methods, and which very few people ever entered because it required documentation and a presentation to the judges, not just produce on a table. She was going to show them everything, the before and the after, the pale cracked soil from her notes in April and the dark productive earth she could dig up today, the method, the chickens, the movable frames, the sequence of plantings. She was going to make them understand not just that she had grown something, but how she had grown it and what it meant for every piece of exhausted frontier land that people like Victor Hale had been calling worthless for years. She told Silas on a Wednesday evening when they were sitting on the porch after a long day and the light was going orange and flat across the fields. He was quiet for a moment. That's ambitious. Yes. You'll need documentation, records, dated. I have them. I've been keeping notes since April. He looked at her sideways. Since the beginning? Since before the beginning. Since I decided to try. She paused. I used to write down everything for my father. Expenses, weather, what we planted, how it came up. I just kept doing it. He was quiet again. The chickens were making their end-of-day settling sounds from the coop. Victor Hale enters the fair every year, Silas said. I know. His operation is the biggest in the county. He usually wins 4 or 5 categories. I know that too. He's not going to enjoy being shown up on his home ground. Maggie looked at the fields. He can enter all the categories he wants. That doesn't have anything to do with what I'm growing. Silas didn't respond to that directly. He turned his hat over in his hands, a habit she'd noticed he had when he was thinking something through. I'll help you with the presentation, he said finally. I know the format they use, did it once, years ago. You entered the soil restoration category? Won it, he said, with a flatness that suggested he hadn't mentioned this because it hadn't seemed relevant. Different county, different time. He put his hat back on. The judges look for specificity, not just what happened, but why. Numbers where you can give them, before and after comparisons. I have all of that. Then you've got a case. He stood up, his left side listing the way it always did when he was tired. You've also got enemies. Don't forget that part. She didn't forget it. It stayed with her in the evenings when she was working on the documentation, organizing her notes, writing the presentation in a clean hand on paper she'd bought specifically for this purpose. As a low background awareness, not quite fear, not quite worry, the specific alertness of someone who has been told to be careful without being told exactly what to be careful of. The first indication that something was shifting came in the second week of August, at the Saturday market. She had her usual table, eggs, the last of the summer beans, a few of the smaller squash she'd set aside for retail sale. The market was full, as it always was in August. The peak of the season, wagons and stalls arranged down the main street of Garner's Crossing with the organized chaos of people who had been doing this long enough to have their own territories. She noticed the looks first, not the polite avoidance of the earlier months, not the careful pity, something different, something that required a second look to identify. People were watching her in the way they watched things that had become interesting without their permission. Carl Briggs stopped at her table, which he had never done before. He was a farmer, solid operation, 30 acres on the north side of the county, sold most of his grain to Hale's mill. He looked at her squash the way the restaurant man had looked at it, that particular commercial assessment, and then looked at her. Heard you're entering the fair, he said. That's right. Soil restoration category? Among others. She met his eyes. Why? He shrugged. Just surprised, that's all. He picked up a squash, turned it over. This from the south field? That was Tom Holloway's worst section. It was. He set it down. What'd you do to it? She told him the short version. The chickens, the frames, the sequence. He listened with the focused attention of a man who farmed for a living and understood what he was hearing. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. That's a real thing, he said slowly. That's not just luck. No, she said. It's not. He bought 2 squash and walked away, and she watched him go and then turned to find 2 other men standing at the edge of her table waiting. Both of them were farmers she knew by name. Both of them wanted to hear the same explanation Carl Briggs had just gotten. She told them. She told them as simply and directly as she knew how, and they listened with the same focused attention, and they bought produce and left. And the next week 3 more farmers came by, and then 4, and she started keeping her explanation short because the line at her table was lasting longer than it used to. It was Dorothy Crane who told her what was happening, on a Saturday in late August, in the particular direct way Dorothy had when she decided that dancing around something was inefficient. People are scared of you, Dorothy said, standing at Maggie's table with her hands folded in front of her. Maggie looked up from counting change. Scared, not of you personally, of what you represent. Dorothy paused. There are 12 farms in this county with soil as bad as, or worse, than what you started with. Most of those farmers have been told, same as you, that it's not worth fixing. Some of them sold to Hale at bad prices because they believed it. The ones who didn't sell are watching what you did and doing arithmetic. That's good. Maggie said. For most of them, yes. Dorothy looked at her steadily. Not for everyone. Maggie understood what she meant. She thanked Dorothy and finished her sale and drove home thinking about what not for everyone covered. She was not naive about Victor Hale. She had understood since the second time he'd come to her farm that he was not a man who simply moved on when things didn't go his way. She had watched him in town, when she was in town, and seen the way the community organized itself around him. Not with affection exactly, but with the habitual deference of people who have depended on one person's goodwill for long enough that the dependence has become invisible. He bought grain from 8 farms. He employed 4 men directly. He was on the board of the bank where Edmund Fitch worked. He was not the only power in the county, but he was the most concentrated one. She thought about Silas's warning, be careful, and tried to decide what being careful looked like in practical terms. Locking the barn at night, checking the chicken coops before she slept, keeping the documentation for the fair in the house rather than the barn, in the tin box her father had used for important papers, in the drawer beside her bed. She started doing all of those things without making much of it. The talk changed in September. She heard it from Silas first, who had heard it at the feed store. Victor Hale had been mentioning, in that offhand way he had of mentioning things that were not actually offhand, that there were questions about the Holloway farm's methods, that the chickens created sanitary concerns, that produce grown in the way she was growing, it might carry issues that standard farming wouldn't. He's saying my food isn't safe, she said flatly. He's suggesting people might want to ask the question, Silas said, in a tone that made clear he found the distinction meaningless. She sat down at the kitchen table. She was tired. It was late September, 3 weeks to the fair, and she'd been working at a pace that was beginning to compound itself into a specific kind of exhaustion where you started making small errors. She'd replanted a section wrong twice last week and had to do it over. Her hands had a permanent low-grade soreness she'd stopped paying attention to. He can't actually stop me from entering the fair, she said. No, Silas agreed. But he can make the judges nervous. He can make buyers nervous. He can make the people who are starting to copy your methods think twice about it. She put her hands flat on the table. What does he want? My farm isn't a threat to his operation. I'm one woman with 62 acres. Silas looked at her with the expression of someone who has lived long enough to understand something that the younger person in front of them hasn't quite gotten yet. It's not the 62 acres, he said. It's the idea. If you go to that fair and win with soil restoration on land everyone wrote off, it changes the conversation. Suddenly people are asking why their depleted land can't be fixed the same way. Suddenly the story about exhausted soil being worthless, the story that's made it easy and cheap for a certain kind of man to buy things up, starts to sound different. Maggie was quiet. He doesn't need your farm, Silas said. He needs the story. She sat with that for a long time after Silas left. The kitchen was quiet, the evening sounds coming through the window. Her chickens settling, the distant low of someone's cattle, a wagon on the road south of her property. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a county that had been organized for a long time in ways she hadn't looked at closely enough. She got up and got her documentation from the drawer and sat back down at the table and went through it page by page. Dated entries. Soil samples she'd taken at the beginning and photographed with descriptions. Yields weighed and recorded. The progression, documented carefully in her methodical, narrow hand of 62 acres from spent to productive. If someone tried to make a case against her methods, this was her answer. Not just the produce, the record. The careful, boring, thorough record of what she had done and when and how. She put it back in the tin box and went to bed. 3 days later, Edmund Fitch came to see her. He arrived in the early afternoon driving his own small buggy, and he had the apologetic look that she associated with him, now the way she associated a weather vane with wind. He was a messenger. She'd stopped blaming messengers a while ago. It was a waste of energy that didn't change the message. Miss Holloway. He sat in the kitchen because she offered him a chair, and he held his hat in his hands the way he always did. I've had a communication from the county fair organizing committee. She poured him coffee. What kind of communication? A concern has been raised. He cleared his throat. About certain farming practices, and their suitability for... He stopped. This is difficult, and I want you to know that I'm not here as anything other than... Edmund. She sat down across from him. Just tell me. He looked at the table. There's been a petition to the fair organizing committee. signed by several members of the local business community, raising questions about sanitary standards in the produce you intend to enter. He paused. The committee is asked to conduct an inspection of your farm before the fair. If the inspection finds concerns, your entries may be disqualified. The kitchen was very quiet. Who signed it? She asked. I'm not at liberty. Edmund. He looked at her, and she could see in his face the specific misery of a decent man doing a thing he knew was indecent, because the alternative was worse for him. Victor Hale led the petition, he said quietly. Others signed. I don't know if they fully understood what they were signing. She nodded. When is the inspection? They want to do it in 2 weeks. That would be, he calculated, 5 days before the fair opens. 5 days. Not enough time to correct anything real if they found a genuine problem, which of course there wasn't, but enough time to make sure any complications cut her off at the deadline. Fine, she said. Tell them to come. Fitch looked up, surprised. You're not going to contest it? No. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. I'm going to invite them. All of them. Anyone who has a question about this farm, I want them here in person. Tell the committee the inspection is open. Anyone who wants to come and look is welcome to come and look. He stared at her for a moment. That's my answer. She met his eyes. You can tell Mr. Hale that too. Fitch left, and she sat alone for a while, and then she went to find Silas. She found him where she usually found him when he wasn't at her place, in his own yard, doing something methodical and quiet. She told him everything Fitch had said, standing in his yard with the afternoon light going sideways through the trees. When she finished, he didn't say anything for a long moment. He looked at the ground, turned something over in his hands. A fence nail, she noticed. He'd been repairing something when she arrived. And then looked up at her. Open inspection, he said. Yes. You sure? I'm sure. She was, she realized. The certainty had arrived sometime between Fitch leaving and now, not with drama, but with the quiet solidity of a decision that's been coming for months. If they come and find problems, I deserve to know. If they come and find nothing wrong, then everyone who's been listening to him knows it too. She paused. It's the only way to make this public instead of private. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Your father, he said finally, didn't give you enough credit. He gave me plenty. I know he loved you, but he didn't see this. He gestured, a movement that encompassed her, the decision, the whole improbable situation. He'd have been surprised. She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. They spent the next week preparing, not hiding anything, not manufacturing anything. That was not the point, and she knew it, and Silas knew it, but making sure everything was documented, labeled, organized so that anyone who came to inspect could see exactly what was there and how it had gotten that way. She made a map of the property with each section marked and dated and described. She prepared a version of her presentation notes in a form that could be walked through physically, so that the judges could move through the farm and understand the progression of the soil rather than just looking at the end result. Silas walked the property with her on the last Sunday before the inspection, moving slowly through each section, and she explained everything as if she'd never explained it before. Because the committee members coming wouldn't know, and she needed to be able to do it simply and clearly and without defensiveness. Don't be defensive, Silas said at one point. I'm not being defensive. You sound like you're defending yourself. She stopped. Isn't that what I'm doing? No. He turned to face her. You're showing them something real. There's a difference. When you defend, you're saying, I'm not wrong. When you show, you're saying, here's the truth, look at it. One of those sounds scared, the other doesn't. She thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. The night before the inspection, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to the farm and turned things over in her mind with the particular anxious quality of a brain that won't stop running even when the body is exhausted. She went through everything she'd prepared. She thought about what questions they might ask and how she'd answer them. She thought about Hale and the petition and the 5 days and the fair. She thought about her father finding her in the kitchen once, very late at night, when she was 12 years old and couldn't sleep before something important. He'd made her a cup of warm milk without saying anything about why she was up, and they'd sat together at the same table in the quiet, and he'd said eventually, "You can't think your way through the night. It just has to pass." She made herself a cup of warm milk. She sat at the table. The night passed. The morning of the inspection was gray and cool, the first real taste of autumn in the air. She was up before dawn, walking the fields one more time in the dark with a lantern, not looking for problems, but just being present with everything she'd built, everything she'd turned these months of her life into. The south field was dark and deep. The center field's last potato section was cleared, and the soil had that particular rich looseness that she'd learned to recognize as the sign of ground that was ready to grow something. The north field, where she'd moved the chicken frames most recently, smelled the way healthy soil smelled, complex and alive, and like the inside of something that was working. She stood in the north field with her lantern and listened to the dark around her. Whatever happened today, this was real. She had done this. Not perfectly. There were sections she wished she'd planted differently, and rows that were still uneven, and things she'd do differently if she had the winter to plan again. But it was real. It was documented. It was here. The first committee members arrived at 9. There were 6 of them, all men, 3 of whom she recognized and 3 she didn't. They arrived in 2 wagons, and behind them came a 4th wagon she hadn't expected. A handful of townspeople who had heard about the open inspection and decided to come and see. Dorothy Crane was among them. Carl Briggs. A few others she knew less well. And behind those wagons, at enough distance to be technically separate from the official party, Victor Hale's large wagon, with Hale inside it. Maggie stood at her gate and watched them all arrive and kept her face still. Miss Holloway. The lead inspector was a man named Alderman Coates, County Agriculture Board, whom she'd met once at a market years ago. He was businesslike and formal in a way that seemed like he was trying to be fair, or at least not visibly unfair. "Thank you for making the farm available." "Thank you for coming," she said. "I want everyone to see everything, the committee and anyone else who came today." She raised her voice slightly, deliberately, so it carried to the townspeople hanging back by the gate. "This farm is open. Come where you like. Ask whatever you want." Coates looked slightly thrown by this. He'd clearly expected her to be more guarded, and then nodded. She started at the south field, because that was where the story started, and she told it the way Silas had taught her to tell it. Not defensively, not like a woman proving something, but like a person showing a real thing to someone who hadn't seen it yet. The committee moved through the sections with their notebooks, digging at the soil in random places, examining plants, measuring. One of the men she didn't know asked sharp questions about the chicken operation, and she answered them with specifics. The number of birds, their rotation schedule, the type of frames, the manure management. He wrote things down. He didn't seem satisfied exactly, but he seemed unable to find what he was looking for. Dorothy Crane had joined the group partway through, and Maggie could see Carl Briggs and the other farmers moving through the sections behind the official party, doing their own less formal inspection. She heard Carl say something to the man next to him that she couldn't make out, and the other man nodded slowly. They were in the center field when one of the committee members, a man named Pruitt from the county seat, who had the satisfied manner of someone who had come prepared to find something, stopped at a section of cleared ground near the east end. "There are plants missing here," he said, "a section that looks disturbed." He looked up at her. "What happened in this section?" She looked at where he was pointing. The section was indeed disturbed. Soil turned over, plants gone from where she'd had some of the last bean planting. Her jaw tightened. She kept her voice even. "I'm not sure," she said. "It was fine 2 days ago." Pruitt wrote something. "Could be evidence of poor farming practice. Instability in the soil." "It's not that," Silas said from behind her. She hadn't heard him arrive, but there he was, standing at the edge of the group with that list to his left and his hat in his hands. "I've been farming for 50 years and I know what poor soil practice looks like. That section has been disturbed from the outside. Look at the edges." Several people looked. Maggie looked. He was right. The edge of the disturbed area was too clean, too defined. Soil disturbance from within, from instability, from plant failure, ragged out gradually. This had a line. "Someone dug this up," Silas said, with the flat certainty of a man stating something obvious. "Recently, within the last 2 days." Pruitt's pen stopped moving. The committee members looked at each other. Maggie looked at the cleared section and felt something cold settle in her chest. Someone had been on her farm, She turned around slowly and looked at the people assembled behind the committee. Dorothy, Carl, the other farmers, the townspeople who had come out of curiosity, and at the back, near the edge of the north fence, Victor Hale's wagon, with Hale himself standing beside it, watching. His face was, as always, carefully pleasant. His eyes were doing their measuring. She held his gaze for a moment. He didn't look away. Neither did she. Coates stepped forward. "Miss Holloway, we'll need to note this in our report." "Note it however you like," she said. She turned back to the field, back to the section of disturbed soil, and she kept her face still. "But note all of it. Note the line at the edge. Note the depth and how it's distributed. Note." She paused, and something cold and certain settled deeper. Note that something was also done to the north coop, because she could see it from where she was standing. The north coop, where most of the older hens were kept, was open. Not just open. The latch had been pulled, the door standing wide, and the interior was empty. She walked to it because she had to see it herself. The committee followed at a slight distance, and the townspeople followed the committee, and the whole improbable group of them made their way to the north coop and stood and looked at the open door and the empty space inside where 112 chickens should have been. There was silence. Then Dorothy Crane said very quietly, "Oh, Maggie." Maggie stood in front of the open coop and looked at the empty space and said nothing at all. The committee members were writing in their books. Some of the townspeople were talking in low voices. Carl Briggs had moved forward and was looking at the latch with the careful attention of a man who built and maintained things and knew what a latch looked like when it failed versus when it was opened. She didn't turn around to look at Hale. She didn't need to. She looked at the empty coop and the disturbed section of her center field, and she did the arithmetic of what had been lost and what had been done and what it meant for the 5 days between now and the fair opening. Her best remaining produce was still in the barn. She checked that automatically, immediately, looked toward the barn from where she was standing, and the barn doors were closed and latched the way she'd left them. Whatever had happened here had not reached the barn, but the chickens were gone. 112 birds in the dark, scattered across the county, unreachable. And a section of her center field had been dug up and cleared specifically in the days before an inspection that was meant to raise questions about her farming. She stood there for a long moment. Then she turned to face Alderman Coates. "I'd like you to write down," she said steadily, "the exact condition of that latch and the edge definition on the disturbed section. I'd like it in the official record that this farm was interfered with before this inspection took place." She paused. "Can you do that?" Coates looked at her and then looked at the latch and then looked at his notebook. "We document what we observe," he said carefully. "Then document what you observe," she said. He wrote. She stood in the morning air with the inspection continuing around her. Committee members moving through her fields, townspeople watching, Carl Briggs still examining the latch with that focused carpenter's attention. And she held herself together with the specific effort of someone who has decided that falling apart is not an option available to them at this moment. The chickens were gone. Part of her harvest was gone. The fair was in 5 days. She looked at the dark south field, the east section with its remaining squash, the barn full of what she'd managed to protect. She looked at the assembled townspeople and the committee with their notebooks and Dorothy Crane's face, which held an expression Maggie had never seen on it before. Not pity, not careful softness, but something harder and more useful. Something that looked like anger on her behalf. She looked at all of it, and she breathed. And then she went to find out what she still had. The count came out to 67 birds recovered. Carl Briggs found the first group of them, 31 hens clustered in the scrub brush along the creek line half a mile north of the property, huddled together the way chickens do when they're frightened and cold and have run out of running. He'd gone looking without being asked, which Maggie didn't find out until mid-afternoon when he came back to her gate with his hat in his hand and 31 of her birds in crates in the back of his wagon. "Found them along the creek," he said, setting the first crate down. "There were more. Couldn't catch them all." She looked at the crates and then at him. "Why did you go looking?" He set down a second crate. "Because someone should." He didn't make more of it than that. He unloaded the remaining crates and left without staying for coffee, which was probably the right call because she didn't have anything to say that wouldn't have come out wrong. Dorothy Crane came back that afternoon too, with her neighbor's boy, and between them they'd found another 12 birds scattered along the south fence line. The boy was perhaps 14 and had clearly been told to help without being told why, and he moved the birds into the recovered coop with the focused efficiency of someone who had been given a job and intended to do it. By evening, Silas had accounted for 24 more from various directions, walking the property perimeter in his listing, methodical way, and the total stood at 67 out of 112. 45 birds still out there, or dead, or too scattered to find. Maggie sat in the barn that evening with the lantern and did the arithmetic of what it meant. The chickens were not, at this immediate moment, the most critical problem. The fair was in 4 days, and the produce for it was in this barn and was not going anywhere. But the chickens were the foundation of everything she'd built. 45 fewer birds meant 45 fewer units of the engine that had turned her soil, and next season's work depended on keeping the flock strong. She wrote the numbers down because she always wrote the numbers down, and then she put the notebook away because looking at them longer than necessary was not useful. She went through the barn inventory instead. What was here? What condition it was in? What was worth entering and what wasn't? The squash was intact. 8 specimens she'd been selecting for weeks, the best of the season, firm and heavy, and the kind of even that comes from soil that's given the plant exactly what it needed. The potatoes were in good shape, though she'd been more conservative in her selections because potatoes were harder to present than something you could hold up and look at. The beans from the final summer planting were done, but she'd dried a selection of them for seed display, which was its own category. And then there was the documentation for the soil restoration presentation. She went through it that night for the 100th time, not anxiously this time, but with the careful attention of someone preparing for an argument they intend to win. The record was thorough. April soil samples with descriptions. Weekly notes on the chicken rotation, dated and specific. The planting progression, section by section. Yields weighed and recorded at each harvest. Photographs. She'd used the camera that had belonged to her mother, a small, simple thing that had been used mostly for family occasions. And she'd documented the soil at intervals throughout the summer. The before and the after, laid side by side, was not subtle. She looked at the photograph from April, pale, cracked, the surface of the south field like the bottom of a dried lake bed, and then at the photograph from last week, dark, textured, the kind of earth that looked like it had opinions about growing things. No one could look at those 2 photographs and make a reasonable argument that the method hadn't worked. She put the documentation back in the tin box and went to bed. She did not sleep well. She didn't expect to. In the morning, Silas came early, before she'd finished her coffee. He sat down at the kitchen table without ceremony and looked at her with the direct assessment he'd developed over months of working beside her. "How are you?" he asked. "Fine." "You're not fine." "I'm functional," she said. "That's what I've got." He accepted that. The committee report. What about it? Coates will submit it today or tomorrow. What he writes determines whether your entries are cleared. He turned his hat in his hands. I talked to him last night. She looked up. You did? He's a fair man, more or less. He documented the latch condition and the edge of the disturbed section, like you asked. He noted that the disturbance was inconsistent with natural soil failure. He paused. He's not going to disqualify your entries. She let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding for 16 hours. He said that? He said the evidence doesn't support disqualification on farming practice grounds. The sanitary concerns in the petition, Silas set his hat on the table, which he never did, which meant this was serious. He found no basis for them. Your chicken management is cleaner than half the operations in the county. Did he say that too? Not in those words, but that's what he meant. He picked his hat back up. The petition itself is a problem for whoever filed it now. You can't petition an agricultural board on sanitary grounds and then have the inspection find nothing and have evidence of sabotage in the same report. That's a document with a story in it. Maggie was quiet for a moment. He's not done, she said. Hale, he won't just let the report sit there. No, Silas agreed. He won't. He looked at her steadily. But right now, this morning, you have 4 days until the fair and a barn full of produce and a clean inspection report and 67 birds in the coop. What do you want to do with that? She looked at the table. She looked at her coffee cup.
She thought about 45 missing chickens and a section of dug-up field and a petition signed by men who might not have fully understood what they were signing, and Victor Hale's wagon at the edge of her property, watching the inspection with that carefully pleasant face. "I want to go to the fair," she said. "Good." He stood up. "Then let's go through the selection one more time."
They spent the morning in the barn, going through the produce with the focused attention of people who understood that what they brought to Kellner in 4 days was not just about a ribbon. It was about the argument. It was about whether anyone who had come to that inspection and seen what they'd seen would walk away with the right understanding of what had been done to Maggie's farm and what the farm itself could do. She selected 8 squash, 12 potatoes of varying sizes to show the consistency. A display of the dried beans alongside fresh ones from the last planting she'd done in August. And the documentation, the full record, organized into a presentation that could be walked through in 15 minutes by a judge who had never heard of Maggie Holloway or her farm or her chickens. Carl Briggs came back on the second day. He came with his wife this time, a woman named Ruth, whom Maggie knew slightly, and they brought a covered dish that turned out to be a roasted chicken, not one of Maggie's, Maggie noted, which was tactful. And they sat at the kitchen table and ate together, which was not something she'd done with neighbors in a long time. "I want to ask you something," Carl said when the meal was mostly done. He had the manner of a man who had been thinking about something for several days and had finally arrived at the asking of it. "That method, the chicken tractors, the rotation," he paused. "Would you be willing to explain it properly to some of us?" Maggie looked at him. "You want to try it. 3 other men I know want to try it. My south acreage is in worse shape than what you started with." He was quiet for a moment. "I sold 2 sections to Hale 3 years ago because I thought they were done. Looking at what you did..." He stopped. "I want to know if I made a mistake." "You made the best decision you had with what you knew," she said. "That's not a mistake. That's just where you were." Ruth Briggs, who had been quiet through most of the meal, looked up at that. "You're very forgiving." "I'm practical," Maggie said. "Forgiving would be if I didn't want anything from it. I want people to try this method. I want it to work for other farms. That's useful to me, too." Carl looked at his plate and then at her. "After the fair, then." "After the fair," she agreed. After they left, she stood at the window for a while. The fields were quiet in the late afternoon. The remaining chickens in their coop, the section she'd worked through all summer, sitting in their various stages of recovery. The dark south field that had been pale clay in April. She thought about what Silas had said, about the story, about Victor Hale needing not the land but the narrative, the story that exhausted soil was worthless and staying that way, that the right response to failing ground was to sell and move on to whoever was buying. She thought about Carl Briggs selling 2 sections 3 years ago because he believed that story. She thought about what it would mean, after the fair, if 4 or 5 farms in the county started working their tired ground the way she'd worked hers. She thought about that for a long time. The third day brought Edmund Fitch, which she had half expected. He arrived in his small buggy in the early afternoon, and he had a different quality to him today. Less apologetic, more tired, the look of a man who had been carrying something heavier than usual. She gave him coffee, and he held the cup in both hands and looked at it for a moment before he spoke. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Professionally, it's not my place, but I think you should know it." "Tell me," she said. He looked up. "The petition that was filed with the fair committee. I'm familiar with the names on it. 3 of them are farmers who've sold land to Hale's operation in the last 5 years. 2 of them are business associates who depend on his buying contracts." He paused. "One of them is a man named Garrett." She was still. "Garrett, who sold me the older hens and—" "Yes." Fitch set his cup down. "I don't know if he understood what he was signing. I don't know if any of them fully did. Victor Hale is—" He stopped, chose his words carefully. "Persuasive in ways that don't always look like persuasion." She thought about that, about 112 chickens in the dark, released, about hands on a latch that she'd kept locked, about a section of her center field dug up to a clean edge the night before an inspection. "Was Garrett involved in what happened to my farm?" she asked. Fitch looked deeply uncomfortable. "I have no direct knowledge of anything," he said. I'm only telling you what I know about the petition. Edmund. He looked at the table. I've heard things, he said quietly. Hale keeps men who do work that doesn't get written down anywhere. Everyone knows this. Nobody says it out loud because... He stopped again. Because of what I said before. About persuasion. The kitchen was very quiet. The inspection report, she said. Coates's report. Will it go anywhere? Will anyone look at the sabotage documentation and do anything with it? Fitch was quiet for a long moment. That depends on how public things get, he said finally. A report sitting in a county office doesn't move on its own. But a report that people know about, that gets talked about, that's a different document. He met her eyes for the first time since sitting down. The people who came to your farm for that inspection, they saw what they saw. That's not in any report. That's in their heads. She understood what he was telling her. After he left, she went to find Silas. He was at his own place, and she walked the 2 miles because she needed the air and the movement, and the particular clarity that came from putting one foot in front of the other on ground she knew. She told him what Fitch had said. He listened the same way he always listened, without interrupting, without performing a reaction, with the full attention of someone who understood that information had weight and should be received carefully. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He's right, Silas said, about the report, about what's in people's heads. He looked at her. The people who came to that inspection, Dorothy, Carl, the others, they saw the latch. They saw the edge of that disturbed section. They saw the empty coop. He paused. They also saw Victor Hale's wagon parked at the edge of your property, watching the whole thing. I know. People put things together, he said, especially people who've been on the business end of being persuaded for a long time. Carl Briggs sold 2 sections of his best recovering soil because he was told it was done. He's thought about that. He's done that arithmetic. He looked at her steadily. The fair is the place where it all becomes public. Not the inspection, not a report. The fair. In front of 3 counties. I know, she said again. Are you ready for that? She thought about it, honestly. She was tired. She was short on sleep and short on chickens, and still doing the math every night on numbers that almost worked, but didn't quite. She had produce in a barn that she had grown from ground that had been called worthless, using a method that people had called foolish, after being told to sell and go to her aunt in Millhaven and have a clean break. Yes, she said. I'm ready. The morning they loaded the wagon for Kellner, she was up before 4. Silas arrived at 5 without being asked. With his own wagon and a calm, practical energy that she had come to rely on the way you rely on a structure that has proven itself sound. They loaded the produce with the care it deserved, patting the squash, crating the potatoes so they wouldn't shift, wrapping the dried bean display so it would travel without losing its arrangement. The documentation went in the tin box, which went under the wagon seat within her reach. They left at first light, the 2 wagons moving down the road in the cool September morning, with the fields on either side of them still dark and the sky beginning to pale in the east. She had not been to Kellner since before her father died. The town was larger than Garner's Crossing, set in a shallow valley with a river running through it, and in fair week it swelled with people from the surrounding counties. Farmers and merchants and families who came partly for the competition and partly for the rare chance to be somewhere with more than one street. They reached Kellner by mid-morning. The fairground was already busy, wagons pulling in from every direction, the particular organized chaos of an event that happened every year and had developed its own instincts. She registered at the main table and received her entry numbers and found her assigned space in the produce hall and began setting up. The produce hall was a long building with tables running the length of it, and the smell inside was good, earth and harvest, and the particular cool, dry smell of stored vegetables in quantity. Other farmers were setting up around her. She recognized a few, didn't know most. The man to her left had entered several squash categories and was arranging his specimens with the focused precision of someone who had done this many times. He glanced at her squash when she put them on the table, looked back at his own, looked at hers again. Didn't say anything. She set up the documentation display beside the produce, the photographs, the soil records, the dated progression notes, and organized it in the sequence Silas had helped her develop. The problem, the method, the result. Anyone who walked past could read it in 3 minutes and understand what they were looking at. Silas went to register his own entries, He'd brought a few things of his own, vegetables from his modest operation, entering mostly because he said it was good to have reasons to clean things up. And she worked alone for an hour, arranging and stepping back and rearranging until it was right. Victor Hale arrived at the fairground at 11. She heard the noise before she saw it, a kind of shift in the quality of the crowd's movement, people stepping slightly aside the way they did for someone accustomed to being accommodated. He came into the produce hall with two men she recognized from his operation and moved through it with the ease of a man on familiar ground. He had entries of his own, his grain operation's best output, and she knew he usually won several categories without much competition. He saw her display from across the room. She watched him see it. The squash on the table, the documentation board beside it, the photographs. He stopped for just a moment, a half second, barely visible, and then kept moving. She turned back to her arrangement and moved a potato 2 inches to the left and left it there. The judges came through the produce hall in the early afternoon. There were 3 of them for the soil restoration category specifically, 2 men she didn't know, and a woman named Helen Marsh, who was apparently from the state agricultural extension and had been brought in because the category was growing and needed someone with credentials. Helen Marsh was perhaps 50, brisk, and precise, and she looked at Maggie's documentation board before she looked at the produce, which Maggie took as a good sign. "Walk me through it," Helen Marsh said, not unkindly. Maggie walked her through it. She started with the photographs, April, the pale cracked ground, and went through each stage, pointing to the dated notes, explaining the chicken rotation, the frame design, the planting sequence. She answered questions directly and specifically, and without performing confidence she didn't feel, which was different from not being confident. Helen Marsh listened. She asked sharp questions about nitrogen levels and soil pH and compaction rates, and Maggie answered what she could from her records, and said plainly when a question went beyond what she'd documented. "I don't have a pH measurement," she said at one point. "I didn't have the equipment for it. But the comparison between the April soil sample and the August one, the texture difference is visible, and the yield tells you the rest." Helen Marsh looked at the photographs side by side for a long moment. "This is April?" "That's April." "And this is August, same section?" "Same section. I have the coordinates marked." The judge looked at the squash on the table, picked one up, turned it over, set it back, looked at the potatoes, made a note. The 2 male judges were asking questions about the chicken management, how she'd prevented disease spread, how she'd handled manure accumulation, sanitary practices. She answered all of it. She had answers for all of it because she'd been doing it for 6 months and had written everything down. One of the male judges said, "There was a sanitary concern raised in a petition before the fair." She looked at him evenly. "There was. The county inspection found no basis for it." She reached into the tin box and produced a copy of Coates's report, which she had made for exactly this moment. "This is the official report from the inspection. The farm was examined thoroughly 5 days ago." He took the report and read it. His expression didn't change much, but she saw his eyes pause at the section that documented the disturbed ground and the latch condition. "It notes some anomalous findings," he said carefully. "It notes evidence of interference with the farm before the inspection," she said, just as carefully. "You can draw your own conclusions." He read a little more, then handed the report back. Made a note. After the judges moved on, she stood at her display table and took 3 slow breaths. Her hands were steady. She was surprised they were steady. Silas appeared at her elbow. "How did it go?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "I told them the truth. That's all I could do." He looked at her display. The photographs, the records, the produce on the table. "It's a good case," he said. "It's a true one." "Those aren't always the same thing," he said. "But when they are, they're stronger." The afternoon moved with the slow, suspended quality of waiting that has no useful outlet. She walked the fairground because standing at her table and staring at it was worse. She looked at other entries, talked to a few farmers she recognized, ate something from one of the food stalls that she tasted very little of. She was near the east entrance when she heard the conversation. 2 men she didn't know, standing near a fence post, talking in the low but not particularly careful way that people talk when they've forgotten to check if anyone's listening. She slowed without stopping. "Hale's men. Word got back to Kellner, apparently, about the coop in the field." "Who told it?" "Briggs, and some others who were at the inspection. Dorothy Crane's been talking since yesterday. A pause. Apparently the latch was pulled from outside. The report documents it. Does Hale know the report's here? He does now. She kept walking. She didn't let herself run. She found Silas and told him what she'd heard, and he nodded with the expression of a man who had expected something and was watching it arrive on schedule. Word travels at fairs, he said. That's part of why they matter. Is it going to be a problem for him? Silas considered. It's going to be a problem for him to explain, he said carefully. Whether it becomes more than that depends on how many people decide they want an explanation. He looked at her. The men who signed that petition, Garrett and the others, they're here. Most people who enter the fair are here. She thought about that, about men who had signed something without fully understanding it, and what it felt like to realize that in public, with evidence in an official report and Dorothy Crane talking, and Carl Briggs here with his account of an inspection he'd been at and seen with his own eyes. The produce results were announced at 4 o'clock. She was back at her display table when the board was posted, and she didn't go to read it immediately. She waited until some of the crowd around it thinned because she needed to read it without anyone watching her face. When she finally pushed through to read it, she stood in front of the board for a moment, looking at the categories and the names. Best squash, open category. Her entry number, first place. Best potato, open category. Her entry number, first place. Soil restoration demonstration, county level. Her entry number, first place. She read it twice. Then she stepped back from the board and let the people behind her move forward. She didn't feel what she'd expected to feel. Not triumph, not the dramatic lifting sensation she'd been imagining since April. She felt something quieter and more complicated than that. A settling, like something that had been suspended for a long time finally coming to rest. She was standing there, holding on to that, when she became aware of the noise. It had started near the main hall. A raised voice, and then several voices, and then the particular quality of a crowd sound that meant something was happening that wasn't planned. She moved toward it automatically, the way you move toward a sound when you're already tense, and your body makes the decision before your mind does. Victor Hale was standing near the produce hall entrance. He was facing a group of men. Carl Briggs was there, and 2 or 3 others from Garner's Crossing, and a few faces she didn't recognize. Hale had his careful, pleasant face on, but the pleasantness was working harder than usual, visibly, the way a structure works harder when there's more weight on it than it was built for. The report documents what anyone can read, Carl was saying. His voice was not raised, which made it carry better. The latch was pulled from outside. The ground was disturbed to a clean edge. You want to explain what that means? I don't know what you're implying, Hale said. I'm not implying anything. Carl held his ground with the particular steadiness of a man who has been thinking about something for several days and has finally arrived at the saying of it. I'm saying there's a document. I'm saying I was there. I'm saying I looked at that latch myself, and I build things and maintain things, and I know what that latch looked like. There was a crowd around them now. Not large, but present, the way crowds get at fairs when something happens that isn't entertainment, but is more interesting than entertainment. Maggie stopped at the edge of it. Hale's eyes found her through the group. She didn't move toward him. She didn't move away. She just looked at him with the same steadiness she'd used every time he'd come to her gate. Clear and direct and without the performance of anger she didn't need to perform. He held her gaze for a moment, and she saw something shift in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not fear, exactly. Something more like the recognition of a man who has made a calculation and is realizing in real time that he made it wrong. He had thought she would sell. When she didn't sell, he'd thought she'd fail. When she didn't fail, he'd thought a petition and an inspection and a night with someone's hands on a latch would be enough to make her fail in a controlled and deniable way. And instead, she was standing at the edge of a crowd at the county fair with her entry numbers on the board at first place in 3 categories and an official inspection report in her tin box, and Carl Briggs asking questions in front of every farmer in 3 counties. She watched him make the decision to leave. He did it with dignity, turned and spoke a word to one of his men, nodded to someone at the edge of the crowd as if the conversation had been a minor interruption, moved toward the fairground exit with the measured pace of a man who was not retreating, technically, but whose direction was unambiguously away. The crowd let him go. People moved aside, not with deference this time, with the particular silence of people watching something and deciding what to make of it. Carl Briggs stood where he was and watched Hale go, and then turned and found Maggie in the crowd, and their eyes met across the space between them. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. But something passed between them that was an acknowledgement, not of victory, not exactly, but of the particular thing that happens when a truth that has been private becomes public, and the people who needed to hear it finally have. She found Silas 20 minutes later, standing near the livestock pens at the far end of the fairground, watching a pair of draft horses with the quiet appreciation of someone who understood good work in any form it took. "Well, he said when she appeared beside him. "Well," she said. He looked at her sideways. 3 firsts. 3 firsts. He turned back to the horses. "Your father," he said, in the tone he used for things that mattered, "would have stood there at that board for an embarrassingly long time." She laughed. It surprised her. It came out real and ungainly and not like anything she would have performed. He would have read it 7 times. "At least," he paused. "You only read it twice." "I had things to do." He almost smiled. It was the closest she'd seen him come to it in 6 months. "Yes," he said. "You did." They stood by the horse pens as the afternoon light went long and gold across the fairground, and the sounds of the crowd moved around them. Families, farmers, merchants, people from 3 counties who had come for the ordinary purposes of a county fair and had gotten something else instead. She was tired. Her back ached in the specific low way that meant a long day had been preceded by too many other long days. She had 67 chickens in a coop at home and a barn that needed winterizing and a debt that had gotten smaller but hadn't finished getting smaller and 100 things to do before the first frost. She was also, she realized, standing at a county fair in September with 3 blue ribbons that belonged to her and a crowd of people who now knew what she had done and how and what had been done to try to stop her. That was real. Whatever came next, that was real, and it was hers, and it couldn't be undone. She stood there and let herself feel the weight of it, all of it, the good and the hard and the complicated, without compressing any of it down. The light went long. The fair moved around them, and Maggie Holloway, who had been told to sell in April, stood on the ground she had not sold and let herself be exactly where she was. The drive back from Kellner took 2 hours, and Maggie spent most of it not thinking about the ribbons. She thought about the chickens, about the 45 still missing, scattered somewhere in the county or gone entirely, and what their absence meant for the work she needed to do before winter closed the ground. She thought about the north field, which hadn't gotten a full rotation because she'd lost the birds before the last section was done. She thought about the pump sound that had gotten worse this week, and the barn roof that needed attention before the first hard freeze. The ribbons were in the tin box under the seat. She was aware of them, the way you're aware of something that has changed the shape of your situation without yet changing the texture of your daily life. The texture of her daily life was still the pump and the roof and the 67 birds and the numbers on the kitchen table at night. Silas drove the wagon ahead of her. She watched the back of his head in the last of the evening light and thought about what he'd said at the horse pens. About her father. She'd been turning it over for 2 hours without arriving anywhere particular with it. Some things you just turned over. She got home after dark, unhitched the horse, put the wagon away, checked the coop. 67 birds present and quiet, settled in for the night in the way chickens settle, with the complete absence of concern for anything that had happened during the day. She stood in the doorway of the coop for a moment and listened to them and found it, as she usually did, unexpectedly calming. She ate something standing at the kitchen counter because she was too tired to sit down and make a meal of it. Then she put the tin box on the table, took out the ribbons, and laid them flat. 3 blue ribbons from the Kellner County Fair. She looked at them for a while. They were physical objects, cloth and ink, not inherently meaningful except for what they represented. The judge's assessment, the official record, the public acknowledgement of a thing that had happened. They didn't change the debt. They didn't bring back 45 chickens. They didn't fix the pump, but they were real. And they were hers, and nobody could take them out of the record. She put them back in the box and went to bed. The next 2 weeks had a quality she hadn't expected. Not triumphant, not transformed, but busier than before, in a way that was both useful and occasionally overwhelming. People came to the farm. Not a flood, not a parade, but a steady and genuine traffic of people who had questions. Carl Briggs came back on the Tuesday after the fair, as he'd said he would, and he brought two other farmers, a man named Henry Oakes, who had 40 acres of depleted ground on the west side of the county, and a younger man named Thomas Wayrick, who was 23 and had just inherited his grandmother's farm and didn't know what to do with soil that hadn't produced reliably in a decade. They stood in Maggie's south field, the field that had been pale clay in April and was now dark and settled and resting for winter, and she walked them through it the way she'd walked the judges through it, starting with the photographs and ending with her hands in the ground. Henry Oakes crouched down and pressed his palm flat against the soil for a long time. He was a quiet man, heavy-set, with the weathered patience of someone who had been farming difficult ground for many years without expecting it to get easier. "How many birds for my acreage?" he asked. "Depends on how you stage it. You don't have to do it all at once." She crouched beside him. "I tried to do everything at once and almost didn't survive it. You could start with one section, 20 birds, proper rotation, do it right on one piece of ground and see what you see in spring." He looked at the soil. "You started with almost 200. I had to. I had a deadline." She stood up, brushed the dirt from her knees. "You don't have my deadline. You can go slower." He was quiet for a moment. "I sold a section to Hale 4 years ago, 30 acres. He said the ground was too far gone." "How was the ground?" "Not great, but not what he said." He stood up slowly. "I think about that." She understood what he meant. She didn't try to make it better or worse than it was. "The ground you've still got? Is it as bad as this was in April?" He thought about it honestly. "Maybe not. Then it's fixable." She met his eyes. "It's going to take longer than you want and cost more than you expect, and there'll be things you do wrong the first season, but it's fixable." Tomas Wayrick, the young one, had been walking the field while she and Henry talked. He came back with the particular energy of someone who has arrived at a decision. "I want to try it," he said. "The whole thing, start to finish." "You'll need birds," she said. "I can help you find the right ones, the rejected stock, the older hens. People think they're buying the wrong thing. They're not." "You have time for that?" She looked at him. 23 years old, standing in her south field with his grandmother's depleted land and a future that was still up for negotiation. She thought about what it would have meant in April to have someone tell her, "You're not buying the wrong thing." "I'll make time," she said. Silas, who had been at the edge of the group throughout this conversation, listening without participating, came to stand beside her after Henry and Tomas and Carl had gotten back in their wagon. They watched the wagon go down the road in the early October light. "You know what you just did," he said. "I told 3 farmers about chickens." "You started something," he said. "Those 3 men will tell 3 more, and those 3 will tell 3 more. And in 5 years, the way this county farms depleted ground is going to be different." He paused. "People will probably forget where it started." She thought about that. "Does that bother you?" "Does it bother you?" She considered it honestly. "No," she said. "The point was never to be remembered. The point was to not lose the farm." He almost smiled again. It was becoming slightly less rare. "And the farm?" She looked at it. The south field dark and resting, the center field cleared and ready, the north field with its last section still waiting for the spring rotation. The barn with its repaired roof, she'd fixed it last week with wood from a downed tree at the east fence. 2 days of work that had left her arms sore for a week. The coop with 67 birds. "The farm is here," she said. The question of Victor Hale resolved itself not with drama, but with the particular quiet deflation of a man who has overplayed a hand and knows it. It started with Garrett. She heard about it from Dorothy Crane, who had developed a habit of stopping by the farm on her way back from market, which Maggie suspected was part genuine friendship and part Dorothy's need to stay close to anything interesting that was happening. "Garrett withdrew his signature from the petition," Dorothy said, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee. "Went to the fair committee directly and said he'd signed without understanding what he was signing." "Did he say who'd told him to sign it?" Dorothy looked at her cup. "He was careful about that. But the committee isn't stupid." She paused. 2 of the other names withdrew as well. The remaining signatures are men who depend on Hale's buying contracts for their living, which tells its own story. A petition with 5 signatures left out of what started as 12, Dorothy said, and an inspection report documenting sabotage. She looked up. Edmund Fitch has been talking to the county agricultural board. Not about anything specific, just making sure the right people have read the right document. Maggie turned her coffee cup in her hands. That's more than I expected from Edmund. He's a decent man in a difficult position. Dorothy paused. He's also the kind of man who, when he finally decides to do a thing, does it properly. She looked at Maggie with the direct steadiness she'd been showing more of lately, as though the months had worn away something that had been in the way of it. Hale is going to be fine, most likely. Men like him usually are. But he's going to be fine in a smaller space than he was before. The story that was useful to him, the story about exhausted ground and hopeless farms and the smart money selling out, that story has a hole in it now, and everyone who matters around here knows it. Maggie was quiet for a moment. She'd thought about this, in the night since the fair, with the same methodical attention she'd given to soil samples and planning schedules. She'd thought about whether it was enough, whether a story with a hole in it was the same as justice, whether justice was even the right word for what she'd wanted. He won't be stopped from buying land, she said. No. And the men who sold to him cheap can't unsell it. Dorothy held her gaze. There's no undoing what's already done. All you can do is change what happens next. That sat in the kitchen for a moment. Is that enough? Maggie asked. She didn't ask it rhetorically. She genuinely wanted to know what Dorothy thought. Dorothy was quiet for a long time, long enough that Maggie began to think she wasn't going to answer. I don't know, Dorothy said finally. I think it depends on what you were trying to do. She set her cup down. If you were trying to get justice for every wrong he's ever done, then no, it's probably not enough. But if you were trying to keep your farm and change what can still be changed, she paused. I think you did that. The debt was paid in November. Not all of it, not yet, but the installment that had been overdue since spring, the one that had defined the shape of everything since April, the one she'd been moving numbers around on the kitchen table to try to make work, the harvest money, the market sales, the restaurant arrangement, the premium that the fair ribbons had allowed her to command on the remaining squash and potatoes. She laid it all out on the kitchen table on a cold Monday morning and found that it added up to enough. Enough for the overdue installment and something left over. Not much, but something. She drove to the bank and put the payment on Edmund Fitch's desk and watched him write out the receipt and sign it. And she took the receipt and held it for a moment before putting it in her coat pocket. The remaining balance, he said carefully, is manageable. Based on next season's projected, I know the numbers, she said, not unkindly. He looked at her across the desk with the expression of a man who had watched something happen that he hadn't expected and wasn't entirely sure how to integrate. Your father would be proud, he said. She thought about that. My father would have asked why it took me so long to think of the chickens. Fitch blinked, then laughed, genuinely, briefly, in the surprised way of a man who doesn't laugh often. Perhaps, he said. She drove home in the November cold with the receipt in her pocket, and the fields on either side of her going brown and bare the way they did every year, the way they would again. The ordinary rhythm of seasons that didn't stop for anyone's circumstances. She was not done. That was the truth she kept coming back to, the one that was both harder and more sustaining than the easier version would have been. She had not arrived somewhere. She had improved her position substantially and had work to do tomorrow and the day after, and the debt would be paid in full by next fall if the season went reasonably well, and the farm would survive into the following year and the year after that. There was no moment where it was finished. There was just the continuation. She found she was all right with that. Silas came for supper in November for the second time. She made beans again, from the seeds she'd saved from the August harvest, dried and stored, which she'd put into a small pot for the occasion. It was not a celebration dinner. Neither of them was the celebrating type. They ate, and after the meal he sat with his coffee and looked at the table in the comfortable way he had when he was thinking something out. I've been thinking about spring, he said. So have I. The north section. You need more birds to finish it properly. He paused. I have contacts from my years up north, people who deal in rejected stock. I can get you the birds at the right price. She looked at him. I don't want you to spend your own money. I'm not going to spend money. He sounded slightly affronted. I'm going to use relationships. There's a difference. He turned his coffee cup. I also think you should expand the rotation into the east section.
You left it because you ran short on time and birds. With a full flock and a proper plan from the start. I know. She'd been thinking about the east section since August. What do you think the yield potential is if we get that section fully turned? He considered it carefully, the way he considered everything. Not quickly, not for performance, just turning it over until he was satisfied he'd looked at it properly. Better than the south field, the east section has more natural drainage. If the soil recovery goes the way the south did, he paused. I think you could triple your potato output. The number sat on the table between them. Triple was the kind of word that changed the shape of something. Triple meant the remaining debt cleared comfortably. Triple meant a margin. Triple meant the difference between surviving and having enough room to breathe. That's optimistic, she said. It's based on what I know about the soil in that section and what I've watched happen to your south field. It's not a guarantee, but it's not a fantasy either. He looked at her directly. You've done the hard part. You've proved the method works on the worst section of your property. The east section isn't your worst ground. She was quiet for a moment. You really think the method is solid enough to recommend to other farms? I think you're going to find out, he said, because Henry Oakes and Tomas Weyrich are both going to try it in spring, and you're going to be the person they come to when they have questions. He paused. I think you should charge for that. She looked at him. Charge them. Your time and knowledge have value. You spent 6 months developing and testing a method that's going to help their farms. Consultation is worth money. He was matter-of-fact about it in the way he was matter-of-fact about most things that other people found complicated. Not a lot, but something. You can call it advice about birds, or you can call it soil consultation. Either way, it's a resource you have and they need. She had not thought about it that way. She turned it over for a moment, and it kept being true the more she looked at it. Her knowledge, the particular hard-won, documented knowledge of what it took to bring exhausted soil back, was a thing she had that other people in the county needed. That was not a small thing. All right, she said. He nodded, once, the same nod he used when she'd finally driven a nail straight. After he left, she sat alone at the kitchen table in the way she often did. Not because she had more to do, but because the kitchen had become a place where she could think without the thinking getting away from her. The lamp was on, and the night was cold outside the window, and the farm was quiet, the way it was quiet in November, a different silence than summer, more settled, more itself. She thought about who she had been in April, 26 years old, alone, with a dying farm and a debt she couldn't cover, and a man at her gate offering her a number that insulted the ground her parents had given their lives to. She had been scared, though she hadn't used that word, because the word would have made the fear more real, and she couldn't afford for it to be more real. She had been exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, the exhaustion of being the person everyone expected to fail, of moving through a town that watched you with that careful pity that is so much worse than indifference. She had been those things, and she had also been something she hadn't known she was until she was in the middle of it. Stubborn in a specific, useful way that turned out to be the most important thing she owned. Not stubborn in the way that means you can't hear reason. Stubborn in the way that means you keep doing the next thing when the thing before it didn't work. Stubborn in the way that means you drive a nail crooked, pull it, drive it again. Stubborn in the way that means you count your chickens at night because it helps you sleep, and you get up the next morning and you move the frames. She had thought, through the worst of it, that the thing she was fighting was Victor Hale and the debt and the exhausted soil and the people who expected her to sell. And those things were real, and they had required real fighting. But the thing she had actually been fighting, the deepest version of it, was the part of herself that kept producing evidence for the argument that she should give up. That quiet interior voice that showed up at 2 a.m. with updated math on all the ways this was probably going to fail. You learn, with time and enough 2 a.m. sessions, that voice is not the same as your judgment. Your judgment is what you do with your hands in the daylight. The voice is just noise. She had learned to let it be noise and keep moving. That was not a lesson she could have been told. She understood that now, sitting at the kitchen table in November with the lamp on and the farm quiet outside. You couldn't hand someone that knowledge. You could only get to it by being in the middle of the thing and choosing, repeatedly, to take the next step instead of the other option. The other option was always available. That was something people forgot to say about hard times. That quitting is always there, always accessible, never more than one decision away.
The fact that you keep going is not because you've run out of the option to stop. It's because you keep choosing not to stop. And the choosing is harder than it looks from the outside and easier than you remember from the inside. She had chosen 100 times. She would choose again tomorrow. Spring came the way it always came to that part of the country. Grudgingly, then all at once, the cold lifting first from the south fields and last from the shadowed north sections where the frost held on into April. She had 67 birds going into winter and 91 coming out of it. Silas had made good on his contacts up north, and the new birds arrived in February. A mixed group of younger pullets and discarded stock that everyone else had bypassed, and that Maggie paid a price for that made her jaw tight when she handed it over, and which she calculated would return her 3 times what she'd spent by fall. She was right about that, as it turned out, but she didn't know it yet in February. In February, she just had birds and faith in arithmetic. She started the east section in March, while the ground was still cold enough to be firm underfoot, because getting the frame set up before the mud came was better than trying to do it after. Silas helped, as he always helped, with that listing efficiency, directing and correcting, saying no, like this when she got something wrong and saying nothing at all when she got it right. Henry Oakes came in March too, with questions about his birds and his first frame construction, and she spent 2 afternoons at his place walking him through the setup. Thomas Weirich came the week after, younger and faster to learn and full of questions that went beyond what she'd documented, theoretical questions about soil chemistry and bacterial activity that she answered as far as she could and referred to Silas for the rest. Silas, for his part, seemed to have developed an unexpected late-in-life interest in being useful to people who weren't him. He showed up at Oakes's farm on a Tuesday without being asked and spent the day helping with frame construction and left without discussing it. She heard about it from Henry, who seemed not quite sure what to do with the information. "He just came?" Henry said. "That's what he does," she said. "Let him." By April, there were 4 farms in the county working depleted ground with chicken tractors. By May, there were 6. The method spread the way most useful things spread, not through formal channels or official endorsement, but through neighbors talking to neighbors, through farmers standing in each other's fields and looking at soil that was behaving differently than they expected. She charged for her consultations, as Silas had said she should. It was a small number, a number she'd set by calculating what her time was worth at a rate that felt honest without feeling greedy, and everyone paid it without complaint, which she took as evidence that the number was approximately right. The money went into a separate account she'd opened for the purpose, which she thought of as the knowledge account, because it was where the value of what she'd learned was stored. The east section, in spring and summer, produced everything Silas had said it would. The potatoes came out in August with the same quality as the South Field's first season, but in larger volume. More acreage, better prepared ground, a season of knowing what she was doing instead of learning it while doing it. She and Silas harvested for 4 days. On the second day, he stopped work mid-afternoon and looked at what was coming out of the ground and didn't say anything for a long time. "Well," she said. "I was right," he said, without satisfaction but without false modesty either. About the triple. She was going to say something about how being right wasn't the same as guaranteeing it, but she looked at the potatoes in the crates around them and couldn't quite make herself deflate the moment that much. "You were right," she said. He picked up his fork and went back to work. The fair in September was different from the year before, quieter in some ways. She knew what she was doing now, knew the road to Kellner and the produce hall and the registration process, and familiarity took some of the charge out of it. She entered the same categories and some additional ones she hadn't been ready for last year. She won 4 or 5, and the one she didn't win went to a man whose grain entry was objectively excellent and deserved it, which she could acknowledge without difficulty. Victor Hale was at the fair. She saw him once, across the produce hall, and he saw her. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read, not the careful pleasantness of before, not anger, something more complicated than either. And then he looked away, and she looked away, and they moved in different directions through the crowd. She didn't feel triumphant about it. She didn't feel much of anything about it, which was itself a kind of answer to a question she'd been carrying. She had spent a year with his presence as the defining pressure of her life, the thing she was pushing against, the force that shaped the fight. And now he was a man across a room whose story had gotten smaller and would probably keep getting smaller. And she had a farm to run and 4 consultations scheduled for October, and a debt that was 3 months from being paid in full. She had better things to do than feel triumphant. Carl Briggs found her near the end of the afternoon in the way he'd developed of appearing at moments that were significant without making a performance of the significance. He'd brought his wife again, and Ruth Briggs shook Maggie's hand with a firm directness that Maggie liked. "Henry Oakes's south section," Carl said. "You see the preliminary numbers?" "He told me last week. Better than he expected by 30%. Carl looked at her steadily. "He said to tell you." "I heard." "He also said—" Carl paused, the way he paused when he was going to say something that mattered. "He said if you hadn't been honest with him last year about going slow, he'd have tried to do it all at once and probably made a mess of it. He said the advice about pacing was worth more than the method itself." She thought about that, about Henry crouching in her south field with his palm on the ground, thinking about 30 acres he'd sold cheap 4 years ago, about the difference between knowing a thing was possible and having someone tell you, "Start small, do it right, the ground isn't going anywhere." "The pacing advice came from making all the wrong decisions about pace myself," she said. "I just passed along the error." Ruth Briggs laughed, a genuine laugh, not polite. "That's a skill," she said. "More people should do it." Silas was waiting at the wagon when she finished. He had his hat in his hands and the late afternoon light behind him and the look he had when he'd been thinking about something and had arrived at a place with it. She got up onto the wagon seat. "Ready?" "There's something I want to say," he said. She looked at him. He didn't often announce things he wanted to say, he just said them. The announcement meant this one was different. "My wife's name was Clara," he said. "We farmed together for 22 years. She was better at it than I was, and she never let me forget it, and I was never bothered by it." He looked at his hat. "When she died, I sold the farm because I couldn't be on it without her. I told myself the ground was too depleted, that it wasn't worth keeping. That was not accurate." He paused. "I sold it because I didn't want to do hard things anymore. I'd been doing hard things for 22 years, and I was tired, and I made a decision I told myself was practical." The fairground was moving around them, people and wagons, the ordinary end of a fair day. "Silas, I'm not finished." He looked up at her. "I moved to that small place and I told myself I was done with serious farming, and I believed it for 15 years. And then your father died and you needed something, and I came over because I had knowledge that would go to waste otherwise, and I told myself that was the whole reason." She waited. "It wasn't the whole reason," he said. "The whole reason is that I was done with serious farming until I wasn't. Until something came along that was worth doing seriously." He put his hat back on, which she had learned to read as the signal that he had said what he needed to say. "You were worth doing seriously. This farm was worth doing seriously." He climbed up onto his own wagon seat. "I wanted you to know that." She sat with it for a moment. The fairground moving, the light going long. "Clara would have liked you," he said, to his horse's ears. "How do you know?" "Because she liked people who didn't give up and didn't make a fuss about not giving up." He picked up the reins. She had no patience for people who made a performance out of being hard. She said hard people were just people who kept going, that's all. Maggie looked at the fields on either side of the road as they drove. Other people's fields, other people's seasons, the ordinary September county going quiet and gold around them. She thought about what it meant to keep going. Not the heroic version, not the version where the keeping going is visible and recognized and rewarded at the county fair. The daily version, the version that happens in the dark before dawn and in the quiet of the kitchen table at night and in the specific moment when you know you're tired enough to stop and you don't stop. She thought about what she would tell herself in April if she could go back. She would not tell herself it was going to be fine. It might not be fine. It hadn't been fine, not consistently, not without cost. She would tell herself the soil can come back. Things that look used up are not always used up. The capacity for something to become more than it currently is, in land, in people, in the relationship between work and outcome, is not always visible from where you're standing. You have to dig for it sometimes. You have to put your hands in the ground and trust what you feel. And you have to find the people worth working alongside and let them be in your life without making it more complicated than it needs to be. Silas had come across 2 miles of road every morning for 6 months and helped her do a thing that mattered to both of them. And they had never once formalized it or discussed what it meant or tried to put a name on it that was bigger than the work itself. That was its own kind of luck. The finding of people who show up. She would tell herself that too. The farm was dark when she got home. She unhitched the horse, put the wagon away, checked the coop out of habit. 91 birds, quiet and present, exactly where they should be. She stood in the doorway of the coop for a moment in the dark. She was 27 years old, and she was tired in the good way, the way that comes from a day that has added up to something. She had a farm with dark soil where there had been dust. She had 4 blue ribbons in a tin box. She had a receipt in a drawer that showed the debt was almost gone. She had farmers across the county doing a thing she'd figured out alone in a dying field with birds nobody else wanted. She had 67 chickens last fall. She had 91 now. That seemed, as a measure of the year, about right. She went inside. She made herself supper from what was in the pantry. Not much, but enough, as it had always been enough. She sat at her father's table in her mother's kitchen and ate alone in the way she'd been eating alone for a year and a half. And the aloneness was not the same thing it had been. It had changed its quality, the way soil changes. Not by becoming something different, but by becoming more fully itself, with more room in it, more air, more capacity for what might still grow. The night was cold and clear. Through the window she could see the south field under the dark sky, resting and ready, full of everything she'd put into it. She thought about April. She thought about pale clay, and a man at her gate, and a number that wasn't enough. She thought about 183 unwanted chickens in the back of a wagon. She washed her plate. She banked the stove. She took the lamp to bed. Tomorrow, the east section needed winterizing, and there were 3 consultations to schedule for November, and the pump was doing its sound again, and she needed to look at the north fence before the ground froze. There was always tomorrow. That was the thing about not giving up. There was always tomorrow, and tomorrow was where the work was. And the work was where she'd found out. The only place anyone ever actually found out what she was made of. She blew out the lamp. The farm settled into the dark around her, breathing its slow autumn breath, and Maggie Holloway, who had been told what her land was worth and had decided to find out for herself, closed her eyes and slept.